uncovered first-hand testimony detailing chilling aspects of Custer's final stand that defy logic. A tragic and dark chapter in American history occurred on June 25, 1876, when General George Custer and his forces made their infamous last stand in the shadow of the Little Bighorn River. Witnesses of Custer and his men's terrible demise characterized the day as being filled with confusion and chaos, as the troops, especially George Herondine and John Berkman, battled against a vast force of Native American warriors. This story illuminates the horrific circumstances they had to deal with. The harsh reality of that tragic day, which history has long warped with myth, is revealed by their recollections. These men were under constant attack. They struggled not just with the imminent threat of combat, but also with the persistent doubt about the future of their commander. The Little Bighorn River was in view, but their intense thirst only made their suffering worse and made them put up with unspeakable circumstances. The conflict was characterized by an uncanny and surreal environment, as gunfire and war cries reverberated across the valley and blended with the distant screams of native tribes in mourning. The horrific events of that day are seen through their eyes, revealing both acts of cowardice and great bravery amid the unsettling quiet that followed the violent storm. What actually happened at Custer's final stand? What choices caused such a catastrophic loss? And how did so many men fall? As narrated by individuals who survived to share their experiences of that tragic encounter, we learn the gory facts that defy reason. To help us out, please like and subscribe to our channel before we go any farther into this bleak story. We left the Rosebud at noon on June 22nd to start our trek. We camped for the night after marching around 12 kilometers up the Rosebud. We resumed our march at daylight on June 23rd, traveling several miles along a track until setting up camp there in the late evening. General Custer had previously dispatched 6 Crow scouts who returned the next day with the report that they had discovered new pony traces that pointed to an Indian hamlet nearby. I could not hear General Custer gathering his officers to discuss something. They dispatched the scouts ahead again. 2 miles beyond the Rosebud's bifurcation, at about 4 o'clock, we arrived at a deserted hamlet site and pitched our tent. Custer ordered the camp to be packed and marched up the right fork of the Rosebud at 11 o'clock that evening, after the scouts had been sent out once more. According to the scouts, they had seen the settlement by morning. About 3 miles away, we hid in a gully close to the creek's headwaters, from the split where the village had been spotted by the scouts. An hour later, General Custer returned, saying he had seen nothing despite galloping forward with his orderlies to scout the area. Nevertheless, the scouts and half-breed leader, Nook Byer, believed that the village was still to come. The Sioux war groups had sighted our forces, the scouts warned, and they had been found. After that, Custer ordered everyone to get ready for combat. We proceeded with caution, traveling perhaps 6 kilometers down a tiny brook. We discovered a lone Indian cabin with a dead Indian inside it, close to the Little Horn Valley's entrance, where dust clouds soared 5 miles distant. Colonel Reno was given instructions to push the scouts toward the dust in a communication delivered by General Custer, who appeared to think the Indians were fleeing. Reno advanced his soldiers across the plains and led them across the river at a natural ford. His soldiers sent their horses into the trees and dismounted to battle on foot after a mile. Soon, Reno's skirmishers were firing back at the mounted Indians who were charging across the plains. Reno, however, gave the order to withdraw to the trees as the enemy started to close off the ford. There was no prospect of a safe escape as the Sioux pursued fiercely, firing at close range. As night fell, Reno's soldiers used saddles, packs, and dead horses to strengthen their position. When the sun came up, the Indians launched another assault, charging several times and even hurling stones at our men. The attacking Indians were caught off guard when Captain Benteen gathered his forces and launched an unexpected offensive. His bravery in the face of flames saved many lives that day. The soldiers had been without water for 36 hours in the sweltering heat by mid-morning, and they were pleading for it. Despite the fact that many were dehydrated and had swollen tongues, the fight continued with no end in sight. The soldiers didn't have enough saliva to wet the crackers and hardtack they tried to consume. Some turned to chewing grass, but it stuck to their lips, making it impossible for them to speak or spit. Several soldiers volunteered for a risky journey to the river, knowing they might not return. because it was reported that the injured were dying from dehydration. There was a ravine that ran from the battlefield to the water's edge, and we were fighting on the bluffs roughly 700 yards from the river. To get to the gully, the men had to run across a 100-yard exposed stretch while being fired upon by Indians standing on the bluffs. After racing across the wide terrain, about 50 men entered the ravine. They discovered it guarded by Indians positioned in the timber across the river when they got to the bottom. Under cover, soldiers could get as close as 30 feet to the water, but the Indians would open fire on them if they ventured out upon the bank. However, the soldiers confronted the threat directly. After filling their camp kettles, several hurried down to the river and took cover behind boulders in the ravine's bend, where they passed back up the hill after filling canteens. 6 or 7 soldiers were wounded in the endeavor, and 1 soldier was killed before the men and wounded were properly supplied. An amputation was necessary for 1 man after a bullet broke the bone in his leg. Although fighting lasted until late in the afternoon, the Indians started to retreat around 2 o'clock. Indian troops had left the battlefield by dusk. The animals, many of whom were near death, could finally be given water and allowed to graze. Colonel Reno moved and strengthened a higher, more powerful position that night. We expected another Indian attack the following day. However, by daylight, no Indians were visible. Around 10 o'clock, we learned that General Terry, with a sizable force, was approaching the valley just 6 miles away, giving the soldiers hope that assistance was on the way. Soon we saw his forces advancing. Mr. Herondine explained his stance in answer to inquiries. Alongside Reno's line, he had entered with the scouts on the left, which consisted of about 60 men, 35 Indians, 6 friendly Sioux, 6 Crows, and the remaining white soldiers. He saw a scout lift his arm with a bloodied knife and then collapse, perhaps dead. Since he hadn't seen the 2 cavalry troops he had left in the woods since, Herondine assumed they had also been dead. While attempting to return to the fort on a soldier's horse, Lieutenant McIntosh was slain. His horse had been shot early in the battle. Additionally, Herondine observed Lieutenant Hodgson, who was injured after his horse went into the river and was shot. Hodgson attempted to use a horse's tail to pull himself up the other bank, but an Indian sharpshooter shot him as he got to the top. None of them or the mules were captured by the Indians, and Custer's supply packs were among the others. The majority of Custer's horses perished in the conflict, and Herondine didn't think the Indians had taken more than 100. He believed some men had been tortured after being taken hostage. Because Isaiah Dorman, a colored scout, had minor gunshot wounds on his legs that appeared to have been caused while he was still alive, he thought the man had been tortured. Skin was cut in strips from the torso of another man. Elderly Indians and squaws prowled the battlefield, wailing crazily. They mutilated their bodies, cut some with knives, and bashed the skulls of the dead and injured with stone mallets. 4 white soldiers' heads were eventually discovered in the Sioux camp, but their bodies were never found. The bodies of 6 squaws were discovered in a gully, indicating that the RIA scouts killed more squaws than our men did. At least 3,000 of the 6,000 individuals living in the Indian hamlet, according to Hayden's estimation, were warriors. The Indians first engaged Reno in combat before moving on to Custer, and then coming back to kill Reno. Herondine said Sitting Bull and 8 or 9 other chiefs were in charge of the same group of Indians who took part in all of the raids. Each of the 5 leaders he recognized carried a flag to rouse their men. The flags came in red, yellow, blue, white, and 1 black hue. According to Herondine, Crazy Horse and his troop participated in the conflict as well, and the Indians sustained losses comparable to those of the whites. Despite the heroic efforts of Custer's soldiers, who killed numerous Indians, none of his forces managed to escape. There were at least 2,500 fighters all around them. Scout George Herondine explained how the men's conduct were driven by fear that spread among them as a result of Reno's seeming timidity. Because he concealed behind a cracker box throughout the conflict, Dan Neely, who currently resides in Gilt Edge, Montana, was known as Cracker Box Dan. Billy Blake feigned to be injured for 2 days in order to avoid fighting, and Aparejo Mickey, also known as Captain Miles Moreland, spent the battle laying behind an aparejo. Despite being courageous warriors by nature, these men behaved fearfully in times of conflict. While wondering what had happened to Custer, Herondine, on the other hand, toiled ceaselessly in the sweltering heat, firing at the Indians and dragging dead horses to create breastworks. While working on the morning of the 25th, the men observed dust and smoke on the ridge. The majority of the Indians joined the battle on the ridge after leaving Reno's soldiers. Some soldiers thought Custer was fighting the Indians, but they were afraid of the worst when the dust and smoke stopped and the gunfire stopped. The men didn't rush to Custer's help even though they heard bursts of gunfire, which many today assume were his distress signals. They left Herondine and others behind, struggling with the heat and thirsting for water. Despite the Indians' protection of the river, Dr. Porter, who worked tirelessly to treat the injured, encouraged the soldiers to fetch water. To bring back water for the injured, a number of soldiers risked their lives by making the perilous journey down the gorge to the river. One man had to be hauled back up the hill after being shot while filling his pail, breaking his leg. A few soldiers were able to return with just enough water to alleviate the misery of the wounded as the day went on. Herondine didn't attempt again, even though the men were really thirsty. During the battle, he saw several horses, including Dandy, shot and killed. In 1968, Dandy was struck, and I imagined that the general would be devastated to hear that he was no longer with us. I remembered Custer saying he might have to replace Dandy because he was beginning to exhibit signs of aging right before we left Fort Lincoln. However, it brought back memories of all the times he and Custer had raced across the plains when I saw Dandy lying there as like he were simply resting. I touched his neck tenderly, and that made me cry. I was shocked when he opened his eyes, which were soft and in pain, and whined quietly. I was perplexed as to why I hadn't attended to him until I realized he was begging for water. Since we were still stranded and didn't know where Custer was, the day seemed to go on forever, with each minute feeling like an hour. Since we had any natural defenses there, we were afraid the Indians would attack from behind at any time. Now, when I think back on that day, it nearly seems like a nightmare, something that was not possible. Sometimes I tell myself that it's all a horrible dream. Perhaps one day I'll awaken, feel youthful once more, return with the 7th, tend to my blush, and tuck Vic and Dandy. Miss Libby might be present, and General Custer, wearing his signature white hat, will be close by, giggling and joking as usual. However, I know in my heart that the fantasy will continue until I get the guts to confront reality. A sharpshooter positioned on a neighboring hill took our troops one by one on the 25th and 26th, while the Indians below opened fire on us. He was deadly accurate with a buffalo gun. Every shot eliminated a man, horse, or mule, but we were unable to see him. He turned out to be a greater danger than the fighters below. Captain Ryan eventually used a long-range rifle to defeat him. When I went to that hill after the fight, I discovered the sniper resting behind the boulders he had positioned for cover, his buffalo rifle still in hand. However, I know in my heart that the fantasy will continue until I get the guts to confront reality. A sharpshooter positioned on a neighboring hill took our troops one by one on the 25th and 26th, while the Indians below opened fire on us. He was deadly accurate with a buffalo gun. Every shot eliminated a man, horse, or mule, but we were unable to see him. He turned out to be a greater danger than the fighters below. Captain Ryan eventually used a long-range rifle to defeat him. When I went to that hill after the fight, I discovered the sniper resting behind the boulders he had positioned for cover, his buffalo rifle still in hand. The majority of the Indians withdrew to their village to grieve their loss as the day went on and the smoke began to clear. They left us stranded on the mountaintop with just enough warriors. We had left camp with Custer earlier in the day, and by then none of us had eaten. Without water, eating raw bacon and hardtack was like swallowing hay. The majority of us were completely spent, and several men were so worn out that they collapsed where they were, not caring about what would happen next. I was placed outside Reno's tent on night watch, which was an unfortunate assignment. He was drinking excessively from a keg when I heard him inside. I once heard him say to another officer as I was marching by, "I wonder where the Murat of the American Army is now." And then he laughed sarcastically. I didn't know who Murat was, but I was upset that Reno was making fun of Custer. The soldiers who had not survived were lying still next to the sleeping males who were strewn across the ground as I continued my patrol. The silence in the night had grown uncanny. I would occasionally pause my marching, straining my ears and eyes in the hopes of catching a glimpse of Custer and his men creeping toward us in the dark. my body aching from the constant worry. But as the night wore on, nothing happened. And when morning finally broke, the air was still and heavy. Down in the valley, where there had been gunfire, smoke, and chaos all day, it was now as silent as a graveyard. I could hear the distant beat of tom-toms and the mournful cries of the Indians, mourning their fallen. Everyone was suffering from the scarcity of food and water. While some guys sat in silence, deep in concentration, others murmured unintelligibly while they slept. My thoughts returned to Custer and Dandy, my horse. I recalled how I was overcome with despair the instant he was shot. That grief lingered with me, making it more difficult to get rid of the feeling that the worst was still to come and that we were doomed. We realized we needed to be ready for whatever lay ahead because of the unnerving quiet. I hope that this account of the events helps you better understand the 1876 Great Sioux War and the Battle of Little Bighorn. Stay tuned for more tales like this one. I'll keep providing you with first-person reports from various conflicts. Be careful, and I'll see you later.